In making the original arrangements for this talk over the phone, Mr. Chomsky asked for a small informal gathering in which there would be plenty of discussion, lots of give and take. And I said I would try to arrange for such a gathering. So instead of making it a public lecture, we made it a lecture sponsored by the Philosophy Colloquium, which usually can be relied upon to draw a crowd of reasonable size. We kept it out of the university calendar. Apparently, the announcement did sneak in the Daily Cal, although with some misprints at least. We asked people to tell only their best friends, but at any rate, so we finally succeeded to keep 11 Wheeler Hall only half filled. This shows that I don't have to go further to introduce Professor Chomsky. I simply say it is a great pleasure for the Department of Philosophy to have him here, and he will now talk about prerequisites of language acquisition. Professor Chomsky.
I'd like to talk about a question which is a very traditional one, and to which answers of the most varied sorts have been defended. Namely, the question which in traditional terms would be something like what the mind brings as its contribution to the acquisition of knowledge, and to what extent the character of what is learned or what is known or what is believed depends on fixed predispositions of the mind. The particular case of language learning is clearly a central, important part of this general problem. And what I'd like to say a few things about is how one might hope to make some headway towards getting some insight into this particular case. More specifically, I want to talk about the matter of how study of the nature of language, rather than, for example, experimental study, might contribute to specifying the innately given mental faculties that constitute the preconditions for acquisition of language. It's customary, and I think quite correct, to distinguish two major competing intellectual currents that dominate discussion of this question. One might be called the Platonistic, rationalist, or nativist current, the other the Aristotelian or empiricist view. Perhaps it would be useful to begin by recalling briefly how these opposing views were summarized by Leibniz in his critique of Locke. I'll quote a couple of paragraphs from Leibniz. Our differences are upon subjects of some importance. The question is to know whether the soul in itself is entirely empty as the tablets upon which as yet nothing has been written, according to Aristotle and Locke, and whether all that is traced thereon comes solely from the senses and from experience, or whether the soul contains originally the principles of many ideas and doctrines which external objects merely call up on occasion, as I believe with Plato. Thus, the senses, although necessary for our actual knowledge, are not sufficient to give it all to us, since the senses never give us anything but examples, that is, particular or individual truths. Now, all the examples which confirm a general truth, whatever their number, do not suffice to establish the universal necessity of that same truth. Thus, necessary truths must have principles whose proof does not depend upon examples, nor consequently upon the testimony of the senses. Although without the senses, it would never have occurred to us to think of them. It's true that we must not imagine that these eternal laws of the reason can be read in the soul as in an open book, but it's sufficient that they can be discovered in us by dint of attention, for which the senses furnish occasions, and successful experience serves to confirm reason. I have made use also of the comparison of a block of marble, which has veins, rather than of a block of marble wholly even, or of blank tablets. For if the soul resembled these blank tablets, truths would be in us as the figure of Hercules is in the marble, when the marble is wholly indifferent to the reception of this figure or some other. But if there were veins in the block which should indicate the figure of Hercules rather than other figures, this block would be more determined thereto, and Hercules would be in it as in some sense innate, although it would be needful to labor to discover these veins, to clear them by polishing, and by cutting away what prevents them from appearing. Thus it is that ideas and truths are for us innate as inclinations, dispositions, habits, or natural potentialities, and not as actions, although these potentialities are always accompanied by some actions, often insensible, which correspond to them. There are innate general principles which enter into the thoughts of which they form the soul and the connection. They are as necessary thereto as the muscles and the sinews are for walking, although we do not at all think of them. The mind leans upon these principles every moment, but it does not come so easily to distinguish them and to represent them distinctly and separately, because that demands great attention to its acts. Thus it is that one possesses many things without knowing it. Well, in short, what he's saying is that the theory of innate ideas in his version and also in Descartes' version is a theory that says that the mind has certain potentialities and predispositions and a framework within which that determines the direction in which knowledge will be acquired, and that once such knowledge, that first of all the innate principles and secondly the knowledge once acquired are not necessarily open to inspection by a person and may have to be drawn out with considerable difficulty. Applying this Leibnizian view to language learning, Wilhelm von Humboldt in 1836 concluded that one cannot really teach language, but can only present the conditions in which it will develop spontaneously in the mind in its own fashion. Thus, what he calls the form of language, by which he means something rather like what would now be called the generative grammar of the language, is to a large extent given, though it would not be available for use without appropriate triggering experience, this being essentially the traditional notion of innate ideas. Experience is necessary not in order to determine the character of what's known, but in order for it to be known. In contrast to Locke's version of this theory, which had nothing to do with what anybody else had to say. In sharp contrast, we have what's perhaps the prevailing modern view, that language is essentially an adventitious construct taught by drill and explanation, as Wittgenstein has claimed, or by conditioning, as Quine holds, and hence relatively independent in its structure of any innate faculties of the mind. For Quine, for example, in Word and Object, the contribution of the mind to language acquisition, or to acquisition of other knowledge, is simply a system of physically defined dimensions in terms of which reinforcement is possible, and perhaps a distance measure of some sort, though it's not so clear how innocent an assumption this might be. For psychologists, for example, for Hull, the contribution of the mind is a set of unconditioned reflexes and the capacity to form associations, and so on throughout the empiricist tradition, one version or another. According to the rationalist view so described, one would naturally think of a person's knowledge of his language as defined by a system of rules, such that, furthermore, a fixed and perhaps fairly narrow general and universal schema exists, innately in the mind, to which each grammar conforms. To the empiricist, on the other hand, language is simply a set of verbal habits, or, quoting Quine, a complex of present dispositions to verbal behavior in which speakers of the same language have perforce come to resemble one another. Well, perhaps this is enough to recall the flavor of two contrasting attitudes as to the nature of language and the faculties necessary to acquire it. It goes without saying that these are not sharply separated positions and that one finds them interpenetrating in the same individual, obviously. For clarity, we might describe the problem of prerequisites for language acquisition in the following terms. Diagrammatically, consider the problem of designing a device called a language acquisition device, which takes as its input some sort of data, call it primary linguistic data, and gives as its output knowledge of a language. This says nothing except to state some framework within which one may continue. So such a device, a language acquisition device, which would of course be universal, that is independent of any particular language, should take as its input the kind of data that the child has available to him, and within the given limitations, that's empirically given limitations of time and access, which are quite narrow in fact, such a device should give as its output a grammar of the language which is comparable to the child's internally represented grammar. To study the question of the nature of this device LA, we must ask about the nature of the input and the nature of the output, these being what is relatively accessible to observation. Well, as far as the input is concerned, we could, if it were important, obtain as close a record of the input as desired. There is no serious problem about getting as close an account of the information available to a child as we like, and that's certainly not the main problem here. In fact, the crucial intellectual issue is certainly what is the nature of the output of such a device. However, before turning to this question directly, I would like to make several side comments on this controversy as briefly outlined before. For one thing, observe that the output of the language acquisition device, knowledge of a language or some representation of it, is not in itself directly observable, but is only inferable from other sorts of data. Hence, the language acquisition device itself is a second-order construct of some sort. From the data that's available, in particular languages, one may come to some conclusion about what is the nature of knowledge of a language, and having come to such a conclusion, one might then turn to the next question: what kind of an input-output system, or what kind of a processing system, or whatever terms you like to think about, could have given that output, given this input? It's a curious fact about the empiricist view that instead of following this natural course, that is, asking what's the result of the language learning process and then trying to infer back to the nature of the process, this being what I think is natural and would ordinarily be followed by someone trying to find out something about a second-order construct of this. However, instead of following this natural course, it begins by making certain a priori assumptions about the nature of language acquisition. Well, for example, the assumptions made by innumerable philosophers, psychologists, and linguists that this device, whatever it may do, can only operate in terms of, say, conditioning and association, or reinforcement, or something else. This being a completely a priori assumption about the nature of language acquisition device being come to entirely independently of any investigation of the input and the output and their relations. Or, more specifically within linguistics, there's been a perfectly analogous development, namely, for a generation or so, linguistics has been to some extent dominated by the search for analytical procedures, which amount to a hypothesis about a language acquisition device under another, this being formulated in slightly different terms, namely a device for the linguist to use as a procedure for analyzing a language, but clear that's a rather analogous question. This latter development is particularly curious. That is, modern linguistics has attempted to determine the nature of language on the basis, again, of a priori assumptions about procedures of analysis that are legitimate, operational, and so on, rather than first determining the nature of language, that is, the output of such a system, and then asking what procedures might be used to discover or determine a thing which has these properties. Well, I won't give any further references, but those of you who are familiar with linguistic literature shouldn't have too much trouble documenting them. It's also interesting that within psychology there's a kind of a similar phenomenon, I think. That is, there are very few studies of what is the nature of a person's knowledge, what is it that the mind knows or believes, or the animal even. However, there's a great deal of study of how one can go about acquiring knowledge. In other words, again, the attention's been directed primarily on the second-order construct rather than on the result of its action from which its internal structure might perhaps be inferred, or one might make some guesses about it. So I notice this simply as a kind of a curious fact about the development of empiricist pictures. In some sense, it's rather surprising and different than one would have expected had the subject been open to, say, ordinary scientific investigation. Well, next point that one might ask is to what extent these a priori assumptions about acquisition of knowledge are supported by any evidence. This is kind of difficult to discuss, actually, because ordinarily they're not stated too clearly. But to the extent that they are clear, I think one can say a few things. In particular, they're very clear in the case of linguistic procedures of analysis that linguists have developed as on essentially a priori basis, that is, believing for some reason these must be the procedures, and from looking at them we perhaps can determine what the result of language acquisition, that is, what the nature of language is like. I'm not going to try to defend this here, but I think it's clear that these procedures are flat wrong. That is, that they give the wrong answer on every single level of analysis. This has been written about elsewhere, and I just assert it without an attempt of proof at the moment. Secondly, as far as conditioning and association is concerned, what is certainly known as a result of a good deal of behaviorist psychology is that within the instinctual repertoire of an animal, various behaviors can be shaped or directed. But this is not the important question, in this context at least. The important question is what develops without shaping, without explicit directing by the external environment. And secondly, the second important question is what are the limits within which this shaping can take place? As far as this question is concerned, there's a good deal of evidence in lower organisms, but very little in higher organisms. And in fact, I suppose it's a general truth that the extent to which a psychologist assumes the existence of fixed structure is inversely related to the complexity of the organism that he's studying. Though this is rather dogmatic, that is, I don't think though it is a general assumption, it's hard to see how it's supported by any evidence. There is a little bit of discussion in higher organisms, in mammals and even primates, about the nature of what is known independently of experience. I won't try to summarize it, but let me mention just one example. Well, Hebb claimed on the basis of some of his investigations that for a chimpanzee, it's a synthetic a priori judgment that snakes are dangerous. He didn't put it in quite those terms, but that's what it amounted to. And he seemed to have fairly decent evidence for that. As far as the place where there is some real evidence about this question is not so much in learning theory, because the learning theorists haven't been too much interested in the questions of the limits on possibility of adaptation. However, there's a good deal of evidence, and quite recent, in fact, on the perceptual side, where empiricists and nativist views have been in more testable conflict, one might think. Well, again, perhaps some of you are familiar with the kind of work that's been going on, but there have recently been neurophysiological studies, most strikingly in the cat, showing that, at least the early results seem to indicate quite clearly that things like line and shape discrimination, line and its orientation, angle perception, and things of this sort, are first of all not, as had usually, in fact always been assumed, the result of deep neural processing, but are rather given by peripheral processing by the visual cortex. And secondly, that an extremely complex system of analyzing lines, their orientations, their angles, their direction of motion, and so on and so forth, is apparently given, at least in the cat, and there's no reason to doubt also in primates, at least although there's no direct study of this. This position, work of David Hugh Bell and various other people, corroborates work that had been done on lower organisms, again on the frog, where it had been claimed, in this case in so many words, that frogs have a synthetic a priori concept concerning flies and their motion. That is, they're capable of seeing flies but not other things, instinctively. As far as the limits of adaptation are concerned, the limits within which one can shape or control behavior, again, there's very little evidence and very little published, not surprisingly. Usually people are interested in their successes and not their failures. However, there's some material in print on the subject. I might mention an article by Breland a year or two ago, which discussed the results of 15 years of failure in the author's terms in animal training, and in which they emphasized what many people had pointed out, but rarely behaviorists, namely that there's a phenomenon of what these authors called instinctual drift, meaning a tendency for the animal, after it's been taught a complex and artificial behavior under the usual techniques of reinforcement and so on, to drift back into instinctual patterns even though those are unreinforced. So, for example, if a pig is taught to do some trick like pick up a coin and put it into a bank and various other things that people enjoy teaching animals to do, they discovered that characteristically, after having had this behavior shaped and directed, the pig would gradually begin to lengthen the period of time between which he had picked up the coin and put it into the bank, although this naturally decreased the amount of reinforcement, and in fact that the pig would do this even up to the point where it wasn't getting fed at all, for a very simple reason, namely that, in fact, the hungrier the pig got, the more it would do it, for, again, a very simple reason, namely that this particular behavior became part of the pig's instinctual feeding behavior, which involves rooting and such things. And the more the pig associated it with feeding, the more it went back into its instinctual patterns. Again, there's too little evidence for anyone to make any conclusions about the possible limitations of adaptation, but I think that from what evidence there is, there's little reason to assume that these limits are very wide, this being a qualitative judgment that I wouldn't know how to substantiate in detail. In any event, one thing is certainly clear, and that is that the major claims that are made, for example, by Skinner and others, are, I think, entirely empty, and one can see this by analyzing them in detail. Well, again, there's been discussion of this in print, and I won't try to substantiate it. In the same connection, one might ask whether there's any evidence at all accumulating about superficial physiological or biological constraints that determine, that somehow specifically adapt humans, let's say, to develop language. Here, unfortunately, there's very little to say, but there are a few things that are suggestive. There's some evidence to the effect that there's been an evolutionary adaptation in man that has lowered the larynx to the point where air can come out of the mouth, making it possible for complex sounds to be formulated, this not being possible in apes, which have a higher larynx and therefore have air coming mostly out of the nose, which can't be controlled. And this, aside from language, appears at least to be a very maladaptive development, since it makes it possible to swallow, to get particles of food in your lungs and choke and so on and so forth, something which happens fairly frequently. And one might guess that, it really does, in fact, one might guess that this might be a superficial evolutionary adaptation having something to do with language. Of course, at any deeper level, let's say level of neural organization or something, there's absolutely nothing to say. Nobody knows a thing about it. In any event, I think that at best one can say that there is no strong evidence, and I think from what's around probably some negative evidence, about the validity of these a priori assumptions about the nature of acquisition of knowledge. And one can add this fact to the observation that it is in fact rather strange that the problem should have been approached in that way. In the same connection, one might point out the curious, perhaps in some sense implausible fact that the empiricist is attempting to attribute a very complex human achievement entirely to months of experience rather than to millions of years of evolution, or to principles of neural organization which may, and from what we know about other animals, perhaps one would suspect are much more deeply grounded in physical law than even any evolutionary development might account for. One might think that this view is implausible in itself, but particularly in the case of language it seems implausible, since language is obviously a human creation. It's one aspect of the world that the child creates for himself, and consequently one would expect it to naturally reflect his intrinsic capacity. You don't invent the world, but you do invent your language. It should also be mentioned that the empiricist has got to face the fact not only that a child develops a complex system rather quickly, but that all children do it in exactly the same way as far as we can tell, quite independently of intelligence and training, that is, ranging from mongoloid idiots up till geniuses, in a very short time, a time that's measured in months or at most years, and at a time of intellectual development when very little else can be done. Well, I think there isn't too much that can be said about the validity of these a priori assumptions, and I won't intend to try to say much more about them right now. However, I think perhaps a more fruitful way of approaching the whole question is to consider not whether these assumptions have any justification, but whether the output of the language acquisition device does in fact have the properties assumed by the empiricist, or whether in fact it does have the properties attributed to it by the rationalist. Thus, we might ask whether this system that is the result of language learning, whether it's, as the rationalist would hold, well, as Humboldt, for example, claimed explicitly, whether it's a system of generative rules that specify the semantic interpretation of an infinity of possible sentences, or, on the other hand, whether it's, as the empiricist would hold, a complex of dispositions to respond. Assuming now that disposition to respond is something that has some content, that is, that means something like probability distribution for a range of responses in physically defined situations or something like that. Well, as between these two positions, I think one can say quite clearly that the empiricist claim is absolutely wrong. That is, a person's dispositions to respond, first of all, it's clear that they obviously reflect not only knowledge of language, but a great many other things: personality, mood, beliefs, intentions, visual acuity, cortical lesions, etc., etc. In fact, these are factors which would determine a person's dispositions to respond overwhelmingly if disposition to respond means anything concrete, like, for example, probability distribution for responses in given situations. And two people who speak exactly the same language in the usual sense might differ enormously in their dispositions to respond in this well-defined sense of the notion disposition to respond. Secondly, it's quite clear, on the other hand, that a person's knowledge of his language has as its very fundamental aspect the ability to understand instantaneously entirely new sentences which are not similar in any physically defined sense to those which he knows or to those which are associated with the sentences that he's heard by conditioning, or to which are obtainable from sentences that he knows by, in this funny sense, by any sort of generalization which is known to psychology. That is, there is no relation, no notion of generalization, nothing of this sort that any psychologist can say a word about, that relates the new sentences that are produced by people in the course of their ordinary linguistic behavior to those that they're familiar with in this odd sense of familiar. Of course, in fact, the person isn't familiar with any sentences. Repetitions of sentences are so infrequent that their actual probabilities are all effectively zero anyhow, and it wouldn't be too misleading to assume that every sentence that comes is essentially quite new. Same is true not only of sentences, but even of sentence types, at least in any very narrow sense of sentence types, like, for example, sequence of word categories. And to convince yourself of this, it's sufficient to do some small calculations, like asking how many 20-word sequences there are where you have approximately 4 choices per word, and so on and so forth. Thirdly, as far as the character of this knowledge of a language, one might ask the question, is it true that where the empiricist has a concrete claim, as for example Quine's claim that physically defined dimensions characterize the concepts that we know, and that reinforcement along these dimensions is all that's necessary to learn these concepts, one might ask whether, in fact, this is true of the ordinary concepts that are, for which there are, let's say, take the simple case, let's say words, names of common nouns or something of this sort. I think it's extremely unlikely that this is true in any very general sense, and many examples have been pointed out for a long time of concepts that are by no means characterizable in terms of some configuration of physically definable dimensions. Well, let me just mention a couple to illustrate. On the one hand, there are clearly sort of syncategorematic concepts, things like useful, good, and so on and so forth, which I don't need to talk about any further. It's quite obvious that there is no complex of properties that characterizes something as useful, let's say. Secondly, there are concepts which are defined by rule, such as, for example, the concept grammatical sentence. Clearly, there isn't any array of physical properties such that grammatical sentence falls along these dimensions in some fashion. Thirdly, there's a point which is quite classical. In fact, one can find it in Aristotle, namely that ordinary concepts are usually defined in terms of some sort of functional way rather than in terms of their physical properties. So to take an example from Aristotle. He argues that the definition of a house, the formulable essence of a house, is a shelter against destruction by wind, rain, and heat. And this is to be much sharply distinguished from what the physicist would define as a house, namely a collection of stones, bricks, and timbers of some sort. That is, the thing that defines the concept house for a human is not what it looks like, but what people do with it somehow. This point has been made rather neatly by Philippa Foote in a paper a year or two ago, in which he pointed out quite correctly, I think, that if a person was to go to a new culture or a new language, and if he were to observe that the people were cutting their meat with things that didn't look at all like knives, but looked like, I don't know what, umbrellas or rulers or something, the correct translation for the thing that they're cutting their meat with would be knife, not, say, umbrella, quite apart from the fact that physically the object would fall into the same configuration of physical properties as, let's say, as an umbrella might or something, whatever you like. This suggests that if one wants to talk about a dimensional space in terms of which concepts are defined, and this is by no means an obvious thing to do. In fact, in the case of these rule-governed concepts like grammatical sentence, it's totally impossible. But to the extent that this is at all adequate, it seems to be the case that the space is one of functions or one of some notion of human action or something of this sort rather than anything physically definable. And here the reinforcement framework has very little to say, I think. Well, finally, these kind of scattered comments might perhaps be concluded by pointing to the irony of the fact that empiricism developed as a kind of a scientific philosophy. In fact, I think it shares few of the characteristics of any scientific endeavor that's known from the very beginning, from its failure to attempt to approach the question of language acquisition scientifically, that is, by inferring back from what we can find out to what we need to assume to explain this, and by its dogmatic insistence that certain ways of learning must be the only ways, and consequently language must be the kind of thing that can come from these ways of learning. Well, returning now to the main issue, what can one say about the character of language acquisition from a study of the grammars which are the results of language acquisition? Well, for one thing, it's clear that we can't put more structure in the language acquisition device than is given by a certain upper bound, the upper bound being the necessity for it to be language independent. That is, you can't put the grammar of English in because that would make it impossible for it to learn Chinese and so on. So there's a well-defined upper bound that one's assumptions about the character of a language acquisition device can't exceed. As to the lower bound, that is to the question how few assumptions to put in, there's really nothing that can be said. There's no reason to make any dogmatic assumptions about the paucity of such internal structure. Well, putting the problem in this way suggests right off that one turn to the question of, one look at the question, what is the nature of, what kind of universals can one find in languages? What kind of general properties can one find that are characteristic of all languages? Here, immediately, a distinction can be made between two kinds of universal properties. To give them a name, let me distinguish substantive universals from what one might call, say, abstract universals. By substantive universals, I mean specific assumptions about the content that one might claim are common to all languages. For example, if one were to say that certain phonetic sounds, let's say, are found in every language, that would be what I want to call a substantive universal. Or if one were to say that noun, verb, and so on and so forth are found in all languages in some well-defined sense of this, that might be a substantive universal. Or if one were to claim, let's say, that certain color names, or that, let's say, the dimension of color gets names in all languages, that would be a universal. And if one were to go on and claim, let's say, that along the color dimension, some specific area, let's say, I don't know, red, gets a name, a single name like that in every language, well, that would again be an example of a substantive universal, and so on. A traditional study of universal language structure pretty much limited itself to questions of this sort, that is, to what kind of substantive universals there might be. However, there is another whole domain of the whole area where one might look for universals, and it's this that I mean to suggest by talking about abstract universals. That is, one may look not for specific things that are found in all languages, but rather for certain formal conditions that are met by the system of rules that are realized in different ways in different languages. So, for example, to take a concrete case, this color case, perhaps it's not true, in fact, presumably it isn't true, that some specific area of the spectrum is selected by every language and given a name. However, there are lots of formal conditions that the set of color names obviously does meet in many languages, well, obvious things. For example, without even checking, it's fairly clear that one would expect that and I'm sure one would find that the color names are all continuous, let's say. Okay? There's no language that has a name for a color that looks like this as far as hue is concerned. And that although probably there's some upper and lower bound on the number of divisions that are made and things of this sort. Well, many conditions of this kind could be met without there being any direct comparability between languages at all. In fact, it might perfectly well be impossible even to translate from one language to another in any systematic fashion, even though many strong formal conditions of this kind are characteristically met by all of these languages. Well, take this case. I mean, suppose every language, obviously, in fact, every language meets the condition that color names are continuous. Still, suppose that one language breaks it up this way, and let's say another language breaks it up this way. Then there isn't any systematic translation procedure. If a word falls in here, you don't know. If a word falls under the domain of this color, you don't know whether to interpret it by this name or this name on the basis of linguistic evidence. And in fact, in general, one might say that to the extent that substantive universals of this kind exist, translation is possible, and roughly to the extent that they don't, it isn't, even though there may be a great deal of common structure in a more abstract sense. Well, I think there are undoubtedly many things of this sort. Just going back to that perceptual work I mentioned, presumably that one might expect that kind of work is beginning to give the explanation for why the notion of physical object meets so many strong abstract conditions in every language, that is, continuity and spatio-temporal contiguity and certain simple Gestalt configurations and so on and so forth. I mean, there's no doubt that no language has a word which designates a discontinuous object consisting of a man's two arms, let's say, or a discontinuous object consisting of a herd of cattle. There is a phrase, herd of cattle, but there's no word designating the single scattered object consisting of the various cows, such that when you poke a pin in one, you can say, I stuck the cattle, and that sort of thing. Or when you cut off a piece of one arm, you say, I cut the X in half, and so on. Again, this means, and this is clearly the case, and a thing of this sort would be another example of an abstract condition met by certain concepts in all languages, and hence presumably deeper in its source than anything learned, though there might not be any direct comparability between the objects named in different languages, let's say. But I think the most striking example of this, at least the example where most can be said, is not in connection with some sort of semantic space or whatever, but rather in terms of this notion of grammatical sentence and semantic interpretation of grammatical sentence. See, here it seems to me that there are rather strong conditions that can be asserted with some degree of plausibility on the form of the grammatical rules of any language, that is, that they fall under certain special types and they're interrelated in certain special ways and so on. Yet these abstract universals, these formal conditions claimed, I think with some evidence, as representing the schema of which every special language is a particular case. These conditions, of course, don't say that a particular rule is going to occur in a particular language, or for that matter, even that any two languages will have the same rule, or that there'll be any direct comparability between them, only that some system of formal conditions will be met by the rules of all languages, perhaps met in different ways. Well, looking at questions of this sort, and particularly the question of abstract universals, where I think there is perhaps a fair amount that can be said, one immediately notes the connection between the study of universals, on the one hand, which is an empirical study that grows out of linguistic investigation, and the study of language acquisition on the other. At the moment, it seems to me quite plausible to assume that wherever any universal can be found, or any plausible claim for a universal can be made, that this universal, abstract or substantive, should be attributed to the language acquisition device as part of its innate structure. At least, it seems to me that should be done unless someone can show some way in which this formal condition could be somehow learned. That is, if someone can show a way in which a child at age 3 can determine for himself that out of the infinity of possible arrangements of systems of grammatical rules, he should pick the kind that has rewriting rules and transformational rules with such and such a interrelation and so on, okay, then perhaps the assumption that this is innate structure could be dropped. But short of that, I think the weakest position is that it is simply part of the structure of a language acquisition device. I would also like to mention that the question of the nature of a language acquisition device that is of innate structure that is necessary for language learning, is that question is very much similar to the question of how one can go about trying to find explanations within linguistics, forgetting altogether about acquisition or anything of that sort. In fact, suppose somebody is interested, as presumably a serious linguist should be, not just in describing what a person's knowledge of his language is like, what the grammatical rules of the language are, but rather trying to give some explanation for why they're this way and not some other way, why certain knowledge about the language happen to have this form and not some other form. The only way to attempt to give an explanation of this sort, you can give as accurate an account as you like of the knowledge of a language, as you can construct as accurate a grammar as you like. Still, the question comes up of justification, of trying to explain why it's this way, not some other way. And there's only one possible technique for justification, and that is to make some assumption about language acquisition. And if you can make some hypothesis about the nature of language acquisition from which it follows that grammatical rules should be this way and not some other way, given the data available, then you've given something which is an explanation for the phenomena. Otherwise, you've simply described it. Not that that's so easy to do, but clearly a serious person would presumably want to go beyond that. Well, again, to give a very simple, concrete example of what I mean, take, for example, the question of what might be called pronounceability, or the notion possible word, or something of this sort. Now, everyone who knows English knows perfectly well that although there isn't any word blick, let's say, there perfectly well could be a word blick. And although there isn't any word thick, there couldn't be a word thick. If there were, it would somehow break an English rule. On the other hand, there are other words like, let's say, slick and flick, and perhaps in some dialects and so on. Okay. As far as observation is concerned, the distinction that is available is this way. That is, certain words have been presented, other words have not been presented. No one who speaks English has ever been presented with the word blick, nor has he ever been presented with the word thick. So as far as dispositions to respond are concerned, let's say, insofar at least as they're based on concrete situations and on evidence and training, one would suppose this kind of a distinction, which is obviously wrong. I mean, the intuitive distinction that everybody makes is this one. Well, here are three different, just from such a simple example as this, one can see three different levels of adequacy that a description of a person's linguistic competence might reach. At the worst, it could describe the data, that is the primary data, correctly and say, okay, this is a word and either of these two things are words. It's a fact, but it's obviously not a significant comment. At a deeper level, one might try to give a correct account of knowledge of a language and say, well, it's a fact that English speakers say that blick is know that blick is a possible word, although they've never heard it, and they know that thick is not a possible word, although, I mean, it's physiologically pronounceable, clearly, and they've never heard it. And that's a higher level of adequacy of description, but still, of course, the deeper question is why you know this. That is, how, given the presentation of this word and not of these two, you know that this one's possible and this one isn't. And the only way to approach this question is to make some assumption about the nature of a language acquisition device. That is, to give some assumption, and in this case an abstract universal, clearly, about the form of a system of phonological rules, the form that they may take. Of course, it's not, obviously not in general true that no language could have this as a word. It's just that there's something about the relation between the data and the output in English which prevents it from being a word. So there's some abstract property of this device such that when the device is applied to the data of English, it makes the distinction this way, although when the very same device is applied to other sort of data, it might make the distinction this way or some other way. And a claim about the structure of this device, a claim about an abstract universal, and there are some plausible ones here, would be the only way in which one might attempt to go beyond the level of description and try to find an explanation for such phenomena. Well, let me give one slightly more complex example. Suppose that you look at the sentences, John, favorite name, persuaded the doctor to examine Bill, let's say. John expected the doctor to examine Bill. It may not be intuitively obvious at first glance, but these sentences are rather different in their deeper syntactic structure. This fact becomes clear if you replace this phrase by its passive, let's say, Bill to be examined by the doctor. In general, active and passive are synonymous in English, in every language. And observe that although this changes the meaning of one sentence, it doesn't change the meaning of the other. That is, although John expected Bill to be examined by the doctor is, at least in some weak sense of synonymity, that is, it's clearly a fact that John expected Bill to be examined by the doctor is true if and only if John expected the doctor to examine Bill. On the other hand, John persuaded Bill to be examined by the doctor is not at all the same as John persuaded the doctor to examine Bill. One could certainly be true and the other false in the second case, but not in the first. So there's got to be something about the structure of these sentences that differentiates them with respect to semantic interpretation, although it's not going to be anything particularly superficial. Well, at this stage, all I've done is say something about knowledge of a language. That is, I say that your knowledge of the language, although this is not information that anybody could give you, in fact, you might not find it without some searching, your knowledge of the language is such that at some deeper level, the structure you assign to these sentences happens to predict that one of them will change its meaning when active is replaced by passive and the other won't. Can one go further than this? Well, perhaps so. But to go further, there's only one way to proceed, and that is to make some assumption about the character of the grammatical rules that determine semantic interpretations in any language. Well, if one accepts the framework of transformational grammar, and this, notice, is a set of to accept such a framework is, roughly in the sense I was talking about the other day, to accept such a framework is to make a very rich assumption about abstract universals, that is to claim that some very intricate set of form of rules and interconnections among rules is actually a universal property of human language, though of course it might be realized in comparable ways in different cases. Anyhow, if one does make that claim, and one tries to characterize this in this traditional way I discussed the other day, for those of you who were there, one immediately observes that related to this sentence is another sentence, namely, John persuaded the doctor that, and here could be anything, for example, that $10 is too high a fee, or that the doctor examined Bill. Whereas there isn't any corresponding sentence related to the second one. That is, there's no sentence like John expected the doctor that the doctor examined Bill, say. So if one accepts, now so far this is just an observation. However, if you take it for granted, if one were to accept the claim that the character of grammatical rules is such that certain kinds of deep structures are mapped onto certain surface structures by certain kinds of rules, then from this fact one would immediately observe that the underlying structure of John persuaded the doctor to examine Bill, that is the internal representation of it, would be something of the form noun phrase, verb, noun phrase, and some sort of complement, where the complement is a sentence with a whole bunch of internal structure. Whereas that in the second case, it's rather different, namely it's a noun phrase and a verb and some complement, no object at all. And then one would observe that among the rules of English, and this is a rule and of many languages, perhaps all, there's a rule that says that identical elements, when you have identical elements in certain related positions, one of them gets deleted. So in particular, if you have identical elements here, this one gets deleted, and of course that isn't really there in the underlying structure anyway. So you get John persuaded the doctor to examine Bill, which has as its deeper structure, John persuaded the doctor that the doctor examined Bill. Here, although you end up with the same surface structure, it's rather different deep structure. Well, that assumption would be sufficient to account for the semantic difference in the two cases, namely, because in the one case, when we say John persuaded the doctor to examine Bill, we're really meaning John persuaded the doctor that the doctor examined Bill. Whereas when we say John persuaded Bill to be examined by the doctor, we're meaning John persuaded Bill that the doctor examined Bill, that Bill be examined by the doctor. And although the two passives really are the same in meaning, as they should be, the underlying structures are different because they have a different noun phrase in them. That's not going to be true in the other case, as you can see if you work it out. I give this example only to illustrate that if one is operating within a framework that makes some claims about the character of grammatical rules, then one is forced to interpret phenomena in a certain way. For example, quite apart from the semantic fact that these two sentences, if one had never observed the semantic fact that these two sentences, one would persuade and one would expect, differ in their underlying structure, one would nevertheless be forced to predict this if they accepted this framework of grammar, because quite apart from that fact, looking at this underlying structure and the rules that map it into surface structures, one would be forced to differentiate between John persuaded Bill to examine the doctor and John expected Bill to examine the doctor. What I'm getting at is this. The only hope of attempting to get explanations for such phenomena is to try to show that because that deep enough assumptions about linguistic structure force you to make those differentiations. Then, of course, if you find that the differentiations are, in fact, correspond to something that you can discover, then you have evidence for the deeper assumptions about structure. However, the thing that one should convince oneself, I think, about examples like this is how strange it is that we do know that these two sentences differ in meaning. It's perfectly possible, in fact, quite likely, that no one in the audience, or I or anyone, has ever heard any case where persuade and expect were involved in a difference in semantic structure. In fact, you have to work very hard to find such examples. Yet the first time they're presented to you, everybody immediately understands how different they are. Now, this kind of information couldn't have been given to you by training or conditioning or drill or any of these other things. How could it? I mean, there have never been any examples presented to you. Yet you do know it immediately, presumably on the basis of the fact that since in order to get this prediction, all you need to know is that John persuaded noun phrase that sentence is possible, but John expected noun phrase that sentence is not. Now that everybody does know, and from that, plus various assumptions about the form of grammar, plus from this single fact about the existence of John persuaded Bill that so-and-so, but not John expected Bill that so-and-so, from that fact and certain assumptions about the form of grammar, it follows that you ought to have the difference in semantic structure in this case. And I can't see how one could hope to account for the fact that everyone does know this difference except on the basis of some such assumption about the underlying structure. Well, I'd like to try to mention one somewhat more concrete case and then conclude with that, where one can perhaps formulate some abstract universal that accounts for some peculiarities. And in order to set this one up, I'll ask you to grant me 2 minutes of linguistic discussion. I'll say this very informally, but I think it will be clear what I mean. Suppose you consider the rules in English for forming relatives and relative clauses and questions. Okay, so forming sentences like the boy who was here and forming sentences like who was here. Questions on the one hand, relatives on the other. It's pretty evident that there is a very simple way of doing this, and it's very well motivated, and the rules would run roughly as follows. There's a first rule, which you might call the rule of WH attachment, which says that when you have a sentence, pick out some noun phrase in it and attach some symbol to it. I call it WH. Okay? So if you have the sentence, I saw Bill, you might select Bill and attach WH to it by the rule of WH attachment. Or if you have a sentence, I saw the boy complement, where the complement is the boy was here. I'm a little bit relying on some things I said yesterday, but perhaps this will be clear anyway. Then the boy, you can attach WH to it, in this case you must, and then you're one step towards forming a relative. So one rule in English that works for both questions and relatives is this rule of WH attachment, which says that certain nouns are designated as subject for the operation. Second rule is a rule which you might call WH placement, which says that the element to which WH is attached goes to the front of the sentence. Okay? So in the sentence, I saw the boy, I saw WH the boy, we take WH the boy and put it over here and get WH the boy I saw. In the case of, let me take I saw the boy, you know the boy, let's say. I saw the boy, you know the boy. If we WH this element, then we put it in front and we get I saw the boy, the WH the boy, you know. Okay? Same operation again, both for relatives and questions. That's the main point I want to mention. Thirdly, there's a rule which says that that when a WH element is in the beginning of a sentence, then the first part of the auxiliary verb moves over to it. So that's a rule which I call auxiliary attraction. And I'm not interested in it for the moment. I just mention it because otherwise the sentences won't come out right. What do I mean? Well, if you say, I saw WH the boy, and you apply the first rule and you get second rule, WH the boy, I saw, then a piece of the auxiliary has to move over to the front and you get WH the boy, did I see? Okay, ending up, who did I see? So there's some rule, some perfectly mechanical rule in English of great generality which says something about how a piece of the auxiliary verb gets over to the front of the sentence. This, forget about for the moment, I'm not interested in it. And fourthly, there's a rule which says that WH plus noun phrase becomes either who or which or various other things, depending on, again, mechanical processes. Well, I don't think anybody should have any particular trouble in formulating such rules in a precise enough fashion to account for the occurrence of relative clauses and questions in English. And what's interesting is that they're the same rules. The only difference is that in the case of a relative clause, a sentence is embedded inside another sentence, whereas in the case of a question, it's not. And in fact, quite generally, one might say that a question is any sentence in which a WH plus noun phrase has no referent inside the sentence, doesn't relate to any word within the sentence. So you can, in fact, have questions without the WH placement, like you saw whom or something like that. Well, so much is quite clear and not at all surprising or particularly interesting. However, it's worth observing that these rules can't be iterated. In other words, if you have a sentence like, who saw whom, that's a possible question. Answer, John saw Bill, that is, replacing both of them. But although you can put one of the WH elements in front by this rule, you can't put them both in front. That is, you can't say who, whom, saw, or did see, or something like that. Okay, that's clear. It's obvious that the rules don't iterate. Same for relative clauses. You can have two WH elements inside a relative clause. Okay, you saw the boy who knows whom, but therefore it's a question because one of them doesn't refer back, and you clearly can't put them both in front. That is, you say you saw the boy who knows or something like that. Okay, so it's clear that this rule doesn't iterate, and in fact so one might ask for an explanation, and in fact there is. You might propose the abstract universal in this case that says that permutation transformations don't iterate. You can apply them once but not twice within a given sentence. And that's a pretty well confirmed rule, I think. But notice that it's a very abstract rule. In fact, it doesn't even mean anything unless you've defined permutation transformation in a very special way and built it into a whole framework of grammar and so on. So within a certain framework of grammar, one could propose this as a universal, and it would explain this not particularly surprising or interesting fact. However, now comes another point. Consider the sentence, I kept the car in the garage. Obviously ambiguous. It might mean the car in the garage is the one that I kept, or I like to keep the car in the garage, not to leave it in the street, or something like that, with a totally different structure. One of these structures clearly comes from, by deletion, I kept the car which is in the garage. The other doesn't. So one of them has a noun phrase in here with the relative clause, whereas the other has a noun and some sort of a complement. Okay? Again, just an observation of fact. However, let's consider what happens when you apply these techniques of question formation to this sentence. Well, suppose we WH the phrase the garage by the rule of WH attachment. That gives I kept the car in WH the garage. Then by the rule of WH placement, we take this thing and put it in the front of the sentence. And then by the rule of auxiliary attraction, we put a do in the appropriate place, and then by the final rule, we replace WH the garage by what. Okay? What you end up with is what did, let me change it to he, just to make it more plausible. He put the car in. Alternatively, where did he put the car if you WH this whole phrase? But that's the same argument there. But now it's important to notice that this sentence is not ambiguous. That is, what did he put the car in can mean only one thing, namely the garage. It can only have the interpretation, he kept the car in the garage, where in the garage is a complement of the verb. Just think what it means. It can't possibly have the interpretation, the car in the garage. That's ruled out. And in fact, you can't say, what did he keep the car that was in? That's just not English. Correspondingly, you can't say, what did he keep the car in the sense of the car in the garage, meaning that car which happens to be in the garage. Well, again, it's very doubtful that anyone has ever been presented with this fact, and it's even more doubtful that everyone has been presented with this fact, yet I think everyone understands it immediately. And it is a peculiarity. Why should an ambiguous sentence, when the rules of question formation are applied to it, suddenly become unambiguous? And why should you furthermore know exactly which ambiguity which term of the ambiguity it does mean? This can only be because of something that you know about the language in general, not something that you've learned about this particular sentence, clearly. And we have the answer, in fact, namely the same rule that gives you the impossibility of saying who, what, saw also predicts this. Because notice that WH placement was already applied once in this top sentence, namely to give you the relative clause which was in the garage. The relative clause, quote, which was in the garage, unquote. That one, right? And then the fact that this was deleted later doesn't change the fact that this rule was applied to form it. But now, if it's impossible to iterate permutation transformations, you can no longer form a question from the sentence with that abstract structural description, because you've already applied once the rule of WH formation. So the principle that we have that is certainly quite well motivated, as we see from the absence of questions with double WHs in the beginning, happens to predict a very peculiar phenomenon of English, namely that there is a certain sentence ambiguous with two different internal structures, such that only under one of those internal interpretations can it go into a question. Well, this is no accident. I'll give you just one more case. Again, a case which I presume that no one who hasn't read one or two articles has ever seen, but that illustrates precisely the same point. Again, in this case, a slightly more complicated fashion. Consider the sentence, Mary saw the boy who was walking to the railroad station. Unambiguous, perfectly clear what it means. Consider the sentence, Mary saw the boy, not who was walking, but rather walk to the railroad station. Well, totally different structure, but again unambiguous, and it's clear what it means. Okay, one means Mary saw the boy who was walking to the railroad station. The other is Mary saw, this is a relative clause modifying boy, but Mary saw the boy do something, namely walk to the railroad station. Now consider the sentence, Mary saw the boy walking to the railroad station. Well, that's ambiguous because it could come from Mary saw the boy who was walking to the railroad station by deletion of who was, the usual thing, or it could mean the other thing, the thing that's analogous to Mary saw the boy walk to the railroad station. Again, quite obvious. So Mary saw the boy walking to the railroad station is ambiguous, two in some sense rather similar meanings, but if you think about it, really quite different. One could certainly be true and the other false. Okay, she might have seen the boy who was walking to the railroad station while he was sitting in his car. Okay, so in one sense, if she saw the boy walking to the railroad station, it would be true, and in the other sense, false. Okay. However, let's consider the question that can be formed by applying the WH inversion rule to the railroad station. Well, without going through all the details, you'll see that that comes out. What did Mary see the boy walking towards? Again, only one possible interpretation, namely the one that's analogous to walk, not the one that's analogous to who was walking. And correspondingly, you can't say things like, what did Mary see the boy who was walking towards? Or, although you can say, what did Mary see the boy walk towards? Well, again, here is a complicated, moderately complicated configuration of examples. Surely no one has ever heard these things or anything analogous to them except by a remarkable accident, and even more surely it's not the case that everyone has heard them and has been trained with them and so on and so forth. And one would want to explain the fact, and this is just a slightly more complicated variant of the other one, that we know that a certain ambiguous sentence, because of some feature of its underlying structure, which isn't even physically represented, of course, that is, it's ambiguous, allows a question to be formed, and another one doesn't allow a question to be formed. And when the sentence is ambiguous, only under one of its interpretations can the question be formed. This is pretty abstract knowledge. It's the kind that it would be hard to bring out, perhaps, but that it's clear is sort of is latent in the Leibnizian sense that I quoted before. And I observe again that, just as in the other case, in this case, if we assume as an abstract universal that permutation transformations can't be iterated, we have an explanation of such a fact. Well, this is the kind of thing that I think is to which most attention should be paid at the moment. Perhaps some of these other notions about abstract universals in semantic space and so on, one can make some sense of them, perhaps. But in this one area, in the area of the underlying system of rules that determine sentence interpretations, there are quite a few things of this sort that suggest, A, the complexity of language processing, that is in the sense of semantic interpretation of sentences, and B, the fact that deep and abstract properties, which I can't imagine in any conceivable way how they could be learned, nevertheless, if they are assumed to exist, will account for the phenomena that occur, and apparently quite universally, at least so far as is known now. Well, this is simply an example. Perhaps it's sufficient to illustrate the general point. From examples of this sort, I think that one is led to the conclusion that, contrary to what has been maintained, for example, by Wittgenstein and the thing I paraphrased before, it seems quite reasonable to assume that the meaning of a word is given to it by a power quite independent of our conscious choice, so that there can be a scientific investigation of what a word really means, and in fact, in this case, an investigation which would take into account precisely these constraints on the possibility for forming semantic systems. And similarly, and much more interestingly at the moment, given our present evidence, it seems that the structure of language in general is perhaps determined by factors over which the individual has no conscious choice at all. Again, contrary to the essentially behaviorist view. That is, a child, I think examples of this kind suggest that a child cannot help constructing an abstract grammar of this special type, transformational grammar of this special type, to account for the data available to him any more than he can control his perception of solid objects or his attention to line and angles. It's not something that he tries to do or has any decision about. It's just any more than he tries to have two eyes or to walk. Furthermore, contrary to the view, again Wittgenstein, that language is taught by drill and explanation, perhaps one can imagine that it, as in the rationalistic view that I quoted before, that it's not taught at all, but rather that it's acquired, which is quite different from being taught, through refinement and differentiation of fixed schemata, rather than by accretion and some sort of generalization of a now unknown kind. And it seems that it may very well be first acquired and then used by rule which is really very strict, though perhaps quite abstract, that is statable only in terms of conditions on a system of rules. How else account for the colossal coincidence that all children, as I said, independently of intelligence, invent this extremely intricate and highly organized theory of a very special kind to account for what's in fact a very small amount of data that's available to them, as you can compute for yourselves by just counting things like the seconds in their lifetime and so on. How come that they all independently acquire, invent approximately identical theories despite wide differences in type of exposure? Observing this, one is naturally led, I think, to the conclusion that the structure of language reflects not so much the course of a person's experience as simply the character of his learning capacities, or in the traditional sense, his innate ideas. Finally, I'd like to make a useful distinction that Wittgenstein draws between, on the one hand, postulation of conscious mental acts that accompany behavior, and on the other hand, the making of hypotheses about the mechanics or the mechanism of the mind. He says that he's concerned only with showing that the first is unnecessary, that is, the postulation of conscious mental processes is unnecessary. And this may or may not be right, but it is clearly a matter that has no connection with the second question, that is, mechanism of mind, as he correctly points out. And he says that he has no interest whatsoever in the second question, that is, with hypothetical mechanisms of the mind. Well, one can be interested in what wants, but it seems to me that insofar as one is not interested in this question of the hypothetical mechanisms of the mind, then one is simply not in a position even to begin to discuss the question of the nature of language or language acquisition. And more generally, quite a large group of modern philosophers, well, I've mentioned Quine and Wittgenstein, and one could add Russell and Carnap and various others, and linguists, in fact, almost all that you can think of, and psychologists, again, large numbers, have been very much concerned with the attempt to give behavioral accounts of traditional mentalistic formulations. Again, that's perhaps a laudable enterprise, or perhaps not, but anyway, it's got to be noted that operational tests are only one way, and in general, I think really the least interesting way, of providing a non-occult, a reasonable, insightful account of mental operations. The other way is something much more akin to the usual method of science. That is the attempt not to give behavioral definitions, but rather to develop some sort of a theory of mental processes for which operational tests may indeed conceivably provide some of the evidence, but which is concerned rather with innate ideas, substantive and abstract universals, constraints on possible systems of concepts, and so on. And I think it's in connection with this latter problem that the study of language structure may be in a position to make a distinctive and informative contribution. Thank you.
I should like to thank Professor Chomsky for his very suggestive talk. He is willing to answer questions and end the discussion. Please direct your questions directly to him. Mr. Moravcik.
You have characterized your criticism position at one point earlier in the paper, though not toward the end, I know, as making some a priori dogmatic assumptions, both as to the idea the number, that there'll be very few of these kinds of operations, which are between the input and the output, and as to the nature of these. And I just thought that although the traditional empiricists don't give this sort of justification, some contemporary ones like Quine do, namely one could put a more charitable interpretation of the empiricists by saying that their attempts is governed by the criteria which are accepted in science, namely of simplicity and economy.
Yeah.
And I'm not now denying at all that you might be able to show that what they want to do won't do, but only that perhaps one could put a more charitable interpretation of what the empiricists try to do, in a sense that it becomes a matter of degrees rather than difference.
Yeah. Well, I think that is the kind of justification that's given, but it does seem to me that this concern for simplicity and economy is entirely out of place here. I mean, if you have a theory that works, you can raise the question whether there's a simpler theory. But if you haven't the ghost of an idea as to how something works, it's senseless to ask about the simplest assumptions that might lead to it. So although, the concern is quite laudable for simplicity, it just has nothing to do with this situation. I mean, it seems to me as if someone were to say, well, look, I'm studying physics, and I really think there should be one elementary particle, and, it's sort of silly to worry about more.
Empiricists of making a priori assumptions. I wouldn't want to argue that his reasons for what he says, when he says the mind is they will be for us. But Leibniz too, argues entirely a priori. And I mean, it seems to me fairly, if you wanted to blame the empiricist for being a priori, then it seems to be fairly unfair to make an emphasis on. Then, when Locke's main argument against innate ideas was that Leibniz's a priori reasoning wouldn't do.
Well, I think Locke's argument against innate ideas was rather different. I mean, it was something about common consent and things of this sort, which had nothing to do with the whole notion. But I'm not so. It had nothing to do with the whole. Locke's argument was in terms of failure of common consent. You know, the fact that children don't have them and that sort of thing. I mean, that was kind of. But that. Yeah.
That was an argument.
Yeah.
But an argument on which he unfortunately didn't spend enough time, although he laid great stress on it, was that Leibniz said that the supposition of innate ideas was necessary.
Right, to account for some facts. Yeah. Yeah.
Knowledge of universal truth.
Right. Yeah.
And Locke argued that it would be enough to show that it was not necessary.
Yeah.
To show that there was.
Yeah. Well, you see, that's again this question of economy. So there are two questions here. One is this question of economy. I mean, if Locke were able to show that on empiricist grounds one could explain the phenomena that Leibniz was concerned with. Of course, he was arguing not against Leibniz, that's the other way around. But, if he had been able to show that, then one would say, yes, he developed a simpler, more economical theory, and by the usual criteria not. But he wasn't able to show that, I think.
I would like to ask you whether you think that Leibniz's reason was a good reason.
Yeah.
Is that one could never achieve knowledge of something universally true because the senses only give instances.
I think there's much to that, in fact.
That's a good reason.
I think that there's got to be some sort of predisposition for some kind of formulation of truths in universal terms, or otherwise, clearly, they'd never be achieved.
But this, you realize, is an a priori argument.
No, I don't think so.
Because you say inconceivable.
Well, if I'm wrong, then I'd like to see how it can happen. I mean, I think that Leibniz is, although of course I wouldn't. Pardon? How? No. In fact, the empiricists accepted the view.
If I give you a list of numbers and ask you to go on, you're very probably you can go on. But this doesn't mean to say that the rule was innate in you.
Unless you can give some way in which the rule was learned, it does.
Well, you're intelligent.
Oh, but that's no answer. I mean, if you're intelligent, see that just to say you're intelligent doesn't mean that you should have gone on from this data to this specific rule. There are millions of rules you could have gone to. Why did you go to one rule?
Millions of rules, indeed. So are there millions of rules innate in you then?
No, I think there's one, or one class of rules, and that, look, this isn't innate. Look, if we suppose forget humans or anything else, if we see some object, a black box, such that when we put in it a small amount of information, it continues to give outputs in some specific direction. Okay, like if we put in it a sequence of integers and it continues in one specific direction instead of thousands of others, what could we assume except that it's something about the structure of this device that causes it to interpret this information in that way? And it seems to me roughly that even the empiricists, I mean certainly Hume at least, when he tried to turn to the question of how induction takes place, he came out directly and said, yes, it's an instinct, what else could it be? And I think that's true. But look, in so many words. But I'd like to come back a little bit to this question of whether Leibniz was justified. I mean, obviously I'm not going to defend his particular conclusions, but it seems to me that the pattern of argument that he suggests is quite reasonable. That is, he says, this is what is known, okay? This is the output of an acquisition device, what is known. Then he says, well, what kind of evidence do we have? Particulars. Okay, that's clear. And he says, can I invent a hypothesis about a processing device which would go from what is available to what is known? And that seems to me a very plausible way to approach the question. One answer that you might give is that what is known is innate. Another answer that you might try to give is that there's some technique for operating on this information to give this output. But until it's given, I don't see any reason to pay any attention to someone who claims that there is such a technique.
Few remarks concern any specific problems which you discuss, problems of not knowledge of language. So these problems seem to be especially interesting, and I would like to have more opportunity of discussing them with you. But the question which I want to touch very briefly is of different nature. You started with distinguishing two different approaches to all these problems. You characterized one approach as rationalistic, was this term which you used, and from explanations which we followed, you include here both, let's say, Platonistic and Aristotelian approach, or what one calls sometimes idealistic approach, and on the other hand, empiristic approach. Well, I happen to be such old-fashioned materialist, nominalist, which I already hear about this division. I anticipate that I certainly shall be on one side of the fence, which means I shall sympathize with those empiricists. And then I noticed with surprise that as far as all the critical statements were concerned, I found myself somehow in complete agreement with you. It means that somehow Coster approached our what we call empiricism. As far as negative statements are concerned, not positive. And I realized later one, I think in a sense, empiricism in this last period has assumed very restricted, almost degenerated form. In life, in natural sciences, it has been reduced to operationalism. Well, the style of Bridgman and so on. In psychology, to behaviorism. But I don't think that actually empiricism implies either of operationalist or behaviorist point of view in the theory of knowledge. Perhaps this division, perhaps the terms are not the essential ones. I would rather like such things as physicalism as opposed to abstractionism, or, well, some other terms which, a certain division which would not coincide exactly with use. The problem for me would be whether one could give an explanation of all this phenomena using, let's say, in general, physicalist terms. Mm-hmm. And I am not convinced that all that is impossible, but that it is very difficult, because the statements made by contemporary empiricists, by behaviorists, do not fit the reality.
Yes, I think the distinction that you're pointing to, which may even be, certainly one that is important, is what might be called a distinction between, let's say, a mentalist position, which would attribute all of these phenomena to some occult medium, and a physicalist position, which would say, no, it has a physiological base. But I think that this is a funny distinction in a way. That is, you see, whether one is let's take this problem of a language acquisition device. At the moment, given the present state of knowledge, it's quite pointless, I think, to ask about the physical mechanisms that might mediate certain kinds of abstract structures. They could be almost anything, we just have no information. So it seems to me the only way to approach the question is to say, okay, what conditions do these physical mechanisms have to meet? Well, maybe they have to meet I suggest maybe they have to meet the condition that they be a transformational grammar. Maybe that's right, or maybe it's wrong. Maybe they have to meet the condition that concepts are defined not in terms of physical properties, but in terms of human action, let's say. Okay, again, now that assumption that, so this abstract discussion of the nature of mental processes certainly shouldn't be interpreted as committing itself to the belief that there is no physical realization of these processes. That is, in this sense, mentalism and mechanism are by no means opposed. They crop up at a historically different period. I mean, it seems to me at a certain stage of perceptual research, for example, it would be important to say the innate characteristics of perception are line, angle, shape, gestalt, and so on. Well, that's an abstract statement about the mind. Maybe at a later stage of physiological research, which perhaps with luck we're beginning to enter into, somebody can say yes, and when I stick this microelectrode in here, I get a response only when a line is going through the retina with a certain angle. So this dichotomy is a real one, but I don't think these two positions are opposed. They're sequential, really. Now, of course, the point is that they are accidentally identified. That is, it's true that the rational, Leibniz was a mentalist also in the sense which I wouldn't want to Except, but that's the thing that seems to me accidental. That is, I don't see why from his rationalistic position about acquisition of knowledge, which attributed it to abstract conditions that are part of the structure of mind, I don't see that from that follows any anti-physicalist assumption. Though from that does follow anti-empiricist assumptions, if empiricism means what was meant in that quote, namely that the block of marble doesn't have any veins, that it could take any shape as well as any other shape.
You said at one point that if you move past the stage of just describing the grammars into the stage of justifying them, you go on from the question, what is a grammar of this language, to the question, why is the grammar the way it is, you don't answer that. You have to look for the answer to that question. The language acquisition device, and no place else. I don't see why you say that. So why begin an answer to the question, why is a grammar this way rather than another way, by pointing out that if it were otherwise, certain distinctions that we obviously need for certain purposes couldn't be made, certain ambiguities that might lead to conclusions couldn't be avoided, and things like that. Why do you say I have to look at the language?
Well, because I don't think, it seems to me that, you see, there is another sense of explanation, another way of explanation, and I think that the one that you're talking about would fit there, a sort of evolutionary explanation. I mean, namely, language is like this because, it evolved this way, and it evolved this way because it's well adapted to ordinary situations and so on. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable, but that's not the, but you see, that doesn't answer the following question. How does the child who's faced with a certain amount of data arrive at the conclusion that's represented by this account of the knowledge of his language? That seems to me an explanation, there is no conflict between an explanation which says English is like this because 3 centuries ago it was some other way and the following historical change took place, and a statement which says the English that a particular child learns who doesn't know anything about the history and doesn't know anything about the function of language and so on and so forth, but just is faced with certain data. His English is like this. Why? Because he imposed a certain structure on it. So, I mean, I don't see, for example, how just as a child couldn't use historical evidence in order to construct the language, to invent, after all, a child has to invent his language. I mean, he's presented with a certain amount of data. He has to invent a language of which this data is somehow triggers or which is an instance. He doesn't know anything about the history. He doesn't know anything about the functions that language has to play. I mean, he doesn't know anything about the fact that the sentence, what did Mary see the boy walking to, shouldn't be ambiguous, let's say. In fact, this is not information that's available to him at all. What he's presented with is sentences used in certain situations. On the basis of a rather small presentation of this, he's got to say, this must be the underlying structure for this. I just don't see any direction to look for an answer to the question how he does it, except in some constraints that he imposes on the task to be performed.
I'd like to take exception with your last thing you're saying, which is the child is not going to know this sort of rule. The language is, after all, used in a social context, even if the child is learning to. And he very quickly should observe there's some ambiguity in the fact that he gets different social responses depending on how these things are operated.
Well, that may show him the existence of ambiguity, but why does it show, what I don't understand, and perhaps it would or perhaps it wouldn't, but how does it show him that these ambiguities should be resolved in this fashion? That's what I don't see.
I imagine that if it shows him the ambiguity, it also should show him which is the norm.
No, because
he will get more acceptable response through use of it.
I don't really quite follow, because the point is, we know intuitively the arrangement of ambiguities and non-ambiguities in this array of sentences without ever having seen them at all. It can't be because we found in social situations that they were reacted to differently. In fact, ambiguity in real life is pretty hard to come by. I mean, you have to invent cases. And of course, in real situations, one is rarely aware of its existence. There's too much that forces you to interpret it one way or another. See, the point that I was trying to make with these examples is that since they are quite new, nobody's ever seen them and so on and so forth, there must be something about our knowledge of the language that predicts the arrangement of ambiguities and unambiguities. It can't be anything about our training or our experience with such examples, because we've never seen them before. And even if we had seen them, there certainly would be nothing in the way in which we had seen them to indicate that they're ambiguous or unambiguous. Consequently, there's got to be some feature about our way of approaching language which gives us a characterization of language from which it follows that these things have such and such a structure. And I particularly wanted to take examples like I persuaded him to become versus I expected him to become to illustrate the fact that, that we really have very little occasion to even discover that there's any difference in interpretation. I mean, until you notice that when you replace the active with the passive, you get a different meaning, which is something that you might discover after working on language for a long time, you wouldn't discover in ordinary life. Until you notice this, you have no occasion for even imagining that there might be a difference of underlying structure.
Don't you think if you take just the word expect and the word persuade out of that context, that you should learn from totally different contexts that these generate different social situations?
Oh, they do, but I don't see how the difference in the situations in which they're used accounts for the fact that I persuaded him to be examined by the doctor is not synonymous with I persuaded the doctor to examine him, whereas I expected him to be examined by the doctor is synonymous with I expected the doctor to examine him. So of course they have different meanings and everything else, but I don't see how from that fact follows this difference in every case.
Therefore, must have something like an idea of what the table is. Because obviously you have to be familiar with that table before. You have to give some sort of account of how it is as a child.
No, I didn't say that, and neither did Leibniz, in fact. See, look, the force of that quote was that innate ideas are like the veins in the marble. You have to labor to find them. I think from the fact that a child develops a concept of table and can recognize different tables, it follows that he had some sort of a predisposition to interpret evidence that was presented to him in one way and not in some other way, which would have been consistent with that evidence. Well, one can make a strong claim and say, okay, the innate idea was a table. That's undoubtedly too strong. That's why I suggest abstract universals rather than substantive ones. So it seems to me there has to be, all that one can suppose is that there's some condition on the formation of concepts that leads him to interpret the little scattered evidence he gets in favor of the assumption that the table is something to be done.
Well, the other thing is this. In this case here, Mary saw the boy who was on the station and so on. Why couldn't someone say this? Your explanation here tonight shows us what counts or what constitutes ambiguity if your sentences which are not used in a particular context. From that, nothing follows about anything we can call the mind or the mind.
I don't follow you. Let me try to restate. I didn't understand, but let me try to restate what I did say and see if we're in conflict here. I mean, what I'm saying is that part of our intuitive knowledge of language, which can be drawn out by appropriate discussion, is that one of these sentences is ambiguous and the other two are not. Another part of our intuitive knowledge of the language is that when we form a question from the ambiguous one, it becomes unambiguous in a very specific way. Now, these are just facts, and I want to look for an explanation of them. Okay, one possible explanation is that your grammar is of this peculiar sort and that you're applying this linguistic universal that says permutation transformations can't be iterated. Now, and I might propose that as an innate idea in a Leibnizian sense, that if you have a predisposition to develop a grammar of this sort. Okay, somebody, an empiricist, could come along and say, no, I can explain how that was learned. Well, I just don't believe it. And if you can, let me show it. That's all.
Well, why couldn't one say simply something like this, that your explanation here tonight constitutes learning?
Well, I certainly didn't teach you that tonight.
Didn't you? I mean, what you're claiming is that we recognize this and that you have drawn this from us, this recognition.
Oh, yeah, but look, I mean, I think if I had said something different, if I'd said this one is ambiguous and these are not, I should think I would have gotten howls of opposition. I mean, I wasn't teaching you some new fact about English. Just showing some peculiar arrangement of things which shows you what your own knowledge of English really is, quite before these items were presented. I wasn't making some sort of random remark about English and trying to force you to believe it or something, but to say, look, if you think about your own knowledge of English, this is what it predicts. So I don't see how that could be thought of as teaching. I mean, what's being taught perhaps is, that's a matter of fact. It's got nothing to say about it.
Maybe I'm not sort of getting this right, but wouldn't this be a parallel to what you've been saying? If I write on the board of the sentence, I hereby undertake to pay you $422.32 for the following things, and some promise which nobody's ever made before. The fact that I recognize that as a promise, as being a promise, as constituting a promise, will show that there must have something, some mechanism by which I can make a promise.
Yeah, that shows that you have a concept of promise, and then comes the question. You see, look, this fact shows that you have a concept of promise. That means it shows that the device which represents you, which took some sort of data and ended up with some sort of system of beliefs or something, ended up with a system in which the notion promise is represented somehow. But only after that fact comes the question about innate ideas, namely, how did this concept of promise arise? Was there a way in which it could have been taught? Is there any way in which it could have, given that our systematization of interrelations among people and so on is such that the concept promise plays a role, is there any way in which how could we have acquired that concept? And here there are two extreme positions that might be maintained and a lot of things in between. One extreme position would say promise is just an innate idea. That is, that such and such an interrelation among people should get a name that's predisposition of the mind. That seems to me pretty plausible, in particular if it turned out to be universal. On the other hand, someone might argue, no, this isn't the case. It could have developed through training, but then the burden of proof is really on him to show that. I mean, I don't see any reason to assume it. Exactly as if we were studying a black box and not a person, you know? Exactly the same. It seems to me we ought to take exactly the same attitude. There is no a priori reason to make any assumption about how much initial structure there is. Well.
Professor Adams, I think we should have only room for 2 or 3 more questions.
I would like to ask in what sense it is that something is explained here. You point out to us that we are able to recognize these peculiar features of our language and can analyze these with certain rules or schemas of some sort. And then you make the claim that we are able to do this, and we are able to do this because we have the capacity to be able to do this. And I don't see how it is that anything.
Well, if that was all that was said, certainly nothing would be explained. I mean, to simply say you know what you know because you had a capacity to learn it is not an explanation. That's just the beginning. But wait, I didn't stop there, really. See, look, I was suggesting an explanation which is not of that sort, namely the permutation that your knowledge of language is represented by abstract operations of a certain sort and that certain types of them can't be iterated. Now, that's not maybe wrong, but it's not empty.
Which, of course, is about the inscription of
About what?
well, about the vocabulary, about the sentences. In other words, you can talk about phrases and clauses and things like this without bringing anything psychological.
Look, let's first forget about the question of psychological and think about the question of explanation. Here is a phenomenon, okay? I'm saying, how could we explain it? Well, the only way of explaining it is by setting up some deeper assumption from which it would follow, okay? Now, the deeper assumption in question, right or wrong, but certainly not empty, is that there are operations of this abstract sort and they can't be iterated. Now comes the psychological question. How did that deeper assumption ever get into your head? Well, it seems to me plausible to assume that it's just part of the way in which you approach language learning, and until somebody can show otherwise, I think that's the natural assumption to make. Because it's inconceivable that such an abstract concept could ever be invented by anyone on the basis of evidence, I think.
Mrs. Walker?
I'd like to make a suggestion that with all your remarks about Wittgenstein, you bypassed Wittgenstein when you began with your diagram about the processing device. And your talk about how this device works and what blocking you, certainly, the furniture of the mind, you know? But this is not the way Wittgenstein thought at all, and nothing you said surprisingly even touches him, because what he said was, in order to understand what this processing device is doing when it's using language, you ought to look at what other things it does. It's not a processing device, essentially. It's something else. It's not a cat in a laboratory. It's something doing things, and doing things conjointly with other processing devices, which really aren't processing devices, but they're doing things and building things. And this was the whole point of the beginning business in investigations. There was a use for language within a larger context, and that context was not a mechanical context. But I mean, why can't someone say, well, the veins in the marble are among the veins in the marble are the fact that people have two hands.
Well, it certainly says it.
But also other things, they're sociable and they...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. But look, as far as the Wittgenstein thing is concerned, I gave that quote particularly to indicate that I'm not talking about his interest. I mean, he says, I am not interested in hypothetical mechanisms of the mind, I'm interested in some other question. Okay, fine. I just conclude from that he's not going to have anything to say about the other topics he does talk about. And look, as far as the other thing was concerned... Well, oh no, that wasn't meant to apply. I think what applies to Wittgenstein is his comment that, for which I'll give you a page reference if you like, that language is taught only by drill and by explicit explanation. I mean, he says that in so many words, and what's more, that's consistent with his general view.
But it really isn't.
Well, but he says it. Okay, we don't have to argue about whether it's consistent, but it's clear that he said it right in about the 10th page of the Blue Books or so. I mean, he says there are two ways of learning language. One is drill, the other is by the use, I forget his phrase, something like the use of rules, and he says by that I mean explicit presentation of rules which are present, which you write down above the act as you carry them out, and so on and so forth.
Well, let me make one more point, and that is his notion of explanation, explaining a rule, would be utterly different from yours because of this beginning, the way he begins,
yeah.
The context in which he conceives language to be working. The fundamental or the essential ground of the rule, if he would ever use it, would have something to do with the way of life. And this is, I think, why
yeah, but that just, okay, but look, I don't believe that he ever attempted to give or succeeded in giving any explanation for rules. I mean, he just said, look, this is the way it is. I mean, a person says 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, therefore he knows the rule, and is there anything more to say? Well, there isn't anything more to say if you're not curious, but if you want to know why, there's a lot more to ask, certainly.
One final question.
Why, in your mind, is the burden of proof lie on the man who has developed?
I can't hear you, sorry.
Why, in your mind, does the burden of proof lie on the man who wants to develop language out of experience, and on the man who says that there are, innate ideas, and yet has no specific way of going from the gene to the speech of the child?
Well, I think there's a clear reason for that. Look, the person who believes in that experience does it, and the person who believes that it's part of the structure of the mind, each of them is in the same position with respect to the physical mechanism. That is, there's no known physical mechanism for learning, and there's no known physical mechanism for underlying structure. So as far as physical basis is concerned, they're in the same position. Therefore, I think that question can be excluded. The point is that we can, I think, make assumptions about innate ideas like this one, from which some things follow about language. And I don't think we can say anything about experience, about use of experience from which things follow about language. So the reason why I think the burden of proof is on the empiricist is that the rationalist has a theory, which has some consequences, some of which seem all right, whereas the empiricist has nothing other than assumptions about how the theory must look. And that's the argument I'm trying to make. And you see, as far as physical realization is concerned, neither of them has anything to say at all, really. Nobody knows what learning is physiologically or initial structure. And
well, I think Professor Chomsky is now entitled in some ways.